Disillusioned in your marriage? I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me on this episode. A lot of people are. Statistics show that the time when divorce rates are the highest is around 5 to 8 years after marriage. Long enough that you see, things aren't going to get better on their own, and I don't want to live the rest of my life this way. But you don't have to be disillusioned, and investing in your marriage is worth it. My guest on the program today, Chelsea Damon, has lived that herself and is helping lots of other young married people and preparing for marriage people learn some of these really, really important mindsets, skills, heart posture. Her recent book, I Thought This Would Make Me Happy: How to Fight Less, Forgive Faster, and Cultivate Joy in Your Marriage, and we'll be talking about that. I do want to preface this conversation with the principles we talk about here are for everybody, but we are not minimizing when there's been real trauma. This is for people where both you and your spouse are people of goodwill. Even when both people in the marriage are people of goodwill, love Jesus, are seeking to do things right, there can still be hard things. There can be disillusionment and hurts. How do you deal with that? That's the kind of situation Chelsea and I talk about in this very encouraging and somewhat challenging conversation as well. Here's Chelsea Damon. How fun to have you on the program today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here and to get to chat with you a little bit. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. We talk a lot about relationships and marriage and intimacy on this program, but I'm in a different generation than you are. And one of the things I love about you and your message is how you phrase and present some of the principles of a healthy marriage in a godly way to people who are just in a different stage of life than I am. Just tell me a little bit about how you got to be where you are and talking about marriage and relationships and love and all of that.
Yeah, so it started about 10 years ago now, which is crazy. And I was working full time. My husband was working full time. We had been married for about a year, 2 years, and we got pregnant 6 months into our marriage. So we had a small child at the time.
Yeah.
And after I would put him to bed, I just felt like I needed a creative outlet. With being so busy with working and taking care of him, I felt like I had no idea who I was even more anymore. And I'd always been like a creative person. So I was like, I'll just like start a blog and start writing. And I was really embarrassed about it at first. I didn't tell anyone. Um, and I wrote about everything. Like I did recipes, I did relationship, marriage stuff, motherhood stuff.
Yeah.
And I would share it on Facebook and Pinterest. And I started getting a lot of positive feedback on the articles that I would write on marriage and family, saying that they were so helpful to people. And I realized it was something that I was actually really passionate to write about. So I started focusing mainly on that. And from there, my blog grew. And I was able to actually write my first book for dating and engaged couples in 2018. And that was a really awesome opportunity. For me, it was like a bucket list item to check off. But yeah, it was amazing to see the feedback after that, that it really helped prepare strong marriages going forward. I got some messages saying like this actually made me break up with my boyfriend or girlfriend, but it was like one of the best decisions I ever made. So I wasn't exactly expecting that, but that was a good outcome. And yeah, and that now I've just come out with my second book for kind of the next step in the process is how I see it, for people who have been married for several years who find themselves struggling a little bit in their current relationship.
Yeah. You started writing about all of this in the early days of your marriage, and it sounds like your marriage still had a lot of growing to do.
Yeah.
Now that you reflect back, what are some of the things you saw that, oh, I didn't completely understand back then that were making me unhappy?
Oh yeah. So there's a lot. The If I could sum up the biggest lesson I ever learned, it was that my spouse was never going to be the true source of my happiness. Like my spouse could make me happy, but I was going into marriage and all the dating relationships I had up until that point, thinking
Yeah.
that that was going to be my source of security. I was going to feel, and yes, these are good things. You want to feel safe with that person. You want to have closeness and intimacy with that person. But I didn't realize just how many deep-seated insecurities I had that I thought my spouse was going to cure, basically. And it turned out a few years into our marriage that I wasn't cured of all those insecurities. And so that was a big lesson to learn that he wasn't going to be that ultimate source of fulfillment, happiness, and security. And he could provide those things, but I would still, even if he did the most perfect job a husband could ever do for those things, I would still need more. And so the biggest lesson I had to learn was that Christ is going to be the only thing that fills
Mhm.
that void in my heart.
Yeah. Wow. I think that's a big thing because even as the title of your book said, you go into marriage thinking this is going to fix me. It's going to
Yeah.
be everything. And when it's not, the disillusionment, were you disillusioned? And I know you've been talking with lots of young couples in the,
Mhm.
the last few years that the disillusionment, feeling like, what did I get myself into? Why am I not happy?
Yeah, yeah, there definitely was that moment. And I think well, growing up, my parents never fought in front of us. I don't know if they just didn't fight or they just didn't fight in front of us. I can imagine they disagreed at some point. And so as a child, I grew up thinking my parents have the perfect marriage. Like, I want my marriage to be just like theirs one day. And then, when Josh and I would have arguments, it's like, I'm so frustrated and angry right now. Why am I feeling this? It feels like it shouldn't be this way. Like on paper, we have everything that we need to be compatible. Like we're both believers. We like have very similar political views. We grew up in kind of similar families. Like both of our parents were still married. They were both Christian families. Like we have all these things on paper that should be adding up. Why are we arguing? Why are we frustrated with each other? And yeah, I really had to try to get to the source of like what was making me unhappy. And I remember this moment one time after an argument where Josh went into the other room and I was just like sitting alone, frustrated, like leaning up against the kitchen counter. And I just remember thinking, like, God, it's just you and me now. Like in that moment, I felt very alone, but it was just finally starting to dawn on me that, like, I was trying to get so much out of him that he was never ever going to be able to provide for me. And and in that moment, I was just like, I realized God is the only one that can actually provide this for me. And so it was like, okay, God, it's just you and me now. And I was able to finally surrender my marriage to God in that moment. And from there, it's just like, it took so much pressure off Josh that I was putting on him to be absolutely perfect, to fill all these needs. And it made it so that I appreciated all the things that he was doing for me so much more. And because I was getting what I needed from God and what I needed from Josh. So that was a big kind of pivotal moment in my heart and mind when it came to my marriage. But yeah, there was this time before that where I was just like, I don't, why is
Mhm.
this so hard? Like, I don't understand. Everything is adding up on paper.
Yeah. I love how you described that it really did look good on paper. Sometimes on this program, we've talked about some of the really destructive things like, affairs or abuse or infidelity. Those things
Hmm.
weren't in your marriage, and yet the fulfillment and connection was still lacking because you were looking in the wrong place. And I appreciate you saying that. Even good Christian couples need something that their spouse can't give that only God can.
Yeah.
And not an easy lesson to learn, but what a difference it can make when you do.
Yeah. It was funny. I spend so much time like on TikTok and Instagram, and I saw this video, just a random video that popped up in my feed of this woman talking about, she wasn't a believer or anything, but she was talking about how she had gone on this fifth date with this guy that they had so much chemistry and they were so compatible and everything was going so well. And in her mind, I don't know if this is widespread in like, secular culture, but in her mind, the fifth date is like maybe when you have sex with the person. And she was saying once they had sex, like all of the sparks like just fizzled out. It was not what she expected. And all of the comments under the video were, that's why you have sex before marriage. So you can try it before you buy it, essentially. And I watched that and I thought, this, there's really just no, there's like this new rigidity, I
Yeah.
think, when it comes to dating and marriage, where it's like, I shouldn't have to change at all. You should fit me like a perfect puzzle piece. And there's no sense that you need to grow and kind of mold with a person and, make up for the strengths that they lack. There's no learning curve. It's just like this works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, I'm out of here.
Mm.
So yeah, I get the sense that there's this rigidity when it comes to
Yeah.
relationships these days.
Yeah. You've alluded to something that I've observed too. There's a lot put into preparing for a wedding, but what about preparing for a marriage and then continuing
Mhm.
to do the work after? I think there's a real fallacy that some have that, the wedding's going to be the highlight and
Mhm.
there isn't really any work that's needed after that. And you're talking about some of the work that is continuing to be needed. What are some of the things
Mhm.
you had to change? You alluded that yeah, it wasn't only Josh. You had to grow up in some ways, if I can say it that way.
Yeah, well, there's probably a lot. I think one of the things was I needed to communicate what I needed better because there's so many times when I would find myself feeling frustrated over an expectation that I never even told Josh that I
Mm,
had. And I would be like huffing and puffing, maybe like speaking under my breath about like, why does he never do this? Why do I always have to like, do the dishes at night? Why doesn't he take that on? Or blah, blah, blah. And I found myself like I never communicated that this is something that I was actually angry about. And it really allowed resentment to just like fester because I never dealt with it. And he couldn't read my mind about like what I was thinking and what expectation was like I wasn't seeing happen. So yeah, that's probably a big one. Where it's like I need to communicate this. Another one was just that you need to be quick to forgive, especially the little things. So
yes.
yeah, and just like almost like you have it at the ready. Like, and I've talked about this before, but it's almost like you need to decide that you're going to have a attitude of forgiveness even before anything happens because, little things happen all the time in marriages. And I think lots of times, you know, there's so many obvious like big things that can happen in a marriage, like affairs, lying about finances, all this stuff that's like blatant in your face. But we don't often talk about like the tiny little things that just lead to like built up resentment. And while communicating about those things is super essential, you also need to be prepared to forgive those little things too and pick and choose your battles, but just kind of cover your relationship with a blanket of grace.
Mhm. I loved how you talked about how big grace needs to be and some of the
Mhm.
changes that can make. I can imagine that was both offering Josh grace and then allowing him to give you grace too.
Mhm.
Both directions. How did the two of you learn that?
Yeah, well, I've also had to learn that it's hard for me to ask for forgiveness. I very much feel like I need to double down. I need to justify what I do. I need to explain it away and say, like, well, if this were different, then I wouldn't have
Yeah,
felt that way, or I wouldn't have said that if you had just done this. And I've learned that I am like at my base nature, I can be pretty slow to ask for forgiveness and apologize. And so I've had to learn to kind of humble myself and take an honest look at me and my own shortcomings. And because Josh, he's the type of person he can be pretty direct and he can see he's a pretty good judge of people. And so he has no problem being like, you're being kind of selfish right now. And I have a tendency to be kind of sensitive. So that to me is like, world shattering. So I had to learn to take that and be like, he's actually like speaking truth, and that doesn't mean he doesn't love me, and it doesn't even necessarily mean that he's disappointed in who I am as a person because like feeling like you let someone down can be embarrassing, it can be very
yeah,
shameful.
yeah,
But and so that would cause me to try to explain it away or rationalize it. But instead, I had to learn how to own up to my own flaws and be prepared to apologize for those things and put them before God and ask for forgiveness and help with that as well.
yeah. I am sure there have been times in your, what, 11 plus years of marriage now,
Mhm.
where you have been doing things, quotes, right. You've learned some of these
Mhm.
things and, extended grace or asked for forgiveness and whatever. And Josh has been slow. I'm asking about this because I know there are some spouses listening right now where, okay, they're doing this and their spouse's heart is not open or moving toward them right now. They are in a hard or negative place. What might you say to somebody who's in that moment, at least for right now?
Yeah, I talk about that issue in like the introduction to the book, like not even in the first chapter, because it is something that people have to deal with all the time. Is like
Yeah,
sometimes you get convicted for something that's been happening in your marriage, and your spouse doesn't feel that conviction at the same time. And you have to decide, like, okay, who's going to be the first person here to make a change? I see this issue happening of like, let's use blame as an
sure.
example, and we're both doing it. But I see that that's unhealthy, so I'm going to start trying to stop blaming uh, anyone else or circumstances for the things that happen. And you're going to make that change before your spouse does. And it might take them a while to even, or maybe never, but it might take them a while to make that change. And in that moment, when you're trying to say be the better person and they're not there yet, that's going to feel really unfair. But no matter what, there's going to have to be the first person who does that. And I just quote the Bible, like God loved us before we loved him. And if we're trying to make our marriage something that mirrors God's relationship with the church,
Yeah.
someone has to make that sacrifice first. And then I think, you know, of course, you want your spouse to come to that place too. And so you need to just cover that in prayer and have open and honest communication. And that's kind of as far as you can take it. Maybe go to marriage counseling together if that's needed. But that's honestly, you can't control your spouse beyond that. And the choice is up to them. So you kind of just need to resign that to Christ and hope that he'll continue that work in your spouse as well.
Yeah. I appreciate you being honest about that you are owning your side of the street. You're doing your job. And it's kind of
Hmm.
like letting your spouse, taking your grubby hands off them so that they and God
Yeah.
can work through their stuff because you can't do it anyway. So release it, hold it with
Yeah.
open hands.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's when we're finally able to allow ourselves to have that extra grace for our spouse. And we, it was a huge thing when I think Josh and I were still dating when I remembered like how there was something that we had been arguing about. I don't even remember what it was. And he had done something that had hurt me. And I was just so frustrated. And I knew that eventually I was going to forgive him, but I just wasn't feeling it at the time. And it was in that moment when God could just kind of like spoke to me, I guess. And I could hear this little voice being like, I've forgiven you of so much. And this little thing that you're holding on to is like minuscule in comparison to that. So how much more should you be able to forgive Josh in this moment? Um, Knowing how much I've forgiven you in the past. So that just kind of like, you
Yeah.
know, broke me down in
Yes.
that moment. But it's true, like knowing just how far from perfect I am and how much grace and forgiveness I've received
Yeah.
really changed my attitude to what I could forgive with Josh. And like I said, it was like a tiny thing that just like bothered me, like maybe a short word. And I was holding on to it because I didn't like the injustice that I felt. But I mean, that's the nature of it. Like grace covers, love covers a multitude of sins. So yeah, it was a hard lesson to learn, but
Yeah.
I think going like it only has served to help going forward in our marriage.
You talk a fair bit about selfishness. And of course, I think
Hmm.
all of us would intellectually know, okay, we're supposed to be like Jesus, not selfish, that's not good. But when things rub you the wrong way in marriage, it riles you up. Talk
Yeah.
about how you learn to deal with selfishness and then, how you tell other people. What do you do with the selfishness germ in your heart?
Yeah. I think that that comes as a crazy rude awakening to people when they first get married is they have no idea how selfish they actually are because they're learning to share their life with someone else and they're learning that someone else is relying on them for whatever, whether it's like practical needs, emotional needs, and that's a rude awakening. And you know, I remember especially when our son was born having this like very pure idea that like I'm just dying to myself every day. And I think when marriage truly thrives is when husbands and wives are both willing to do this together. Like I once heard marriage referred to as like spackling, where it's like if you have these gaps, then your husband can help fill them in your life. Like if he has strengths and you have weaknesses, and his spackling will kind of like fill that up for you and yours for your spouse. And yeah, I think I love that picture, like seeing how our different strengths and weaknesses kind of like can complement each other. And then for everything in between, you just pray for extra grace and work on it and grow together. But yeah, I think having that grace for each other goes a long way.
Yeah. Another concept that you talk a fair bit about is generosity, which I thought was beautiful. And I think that means much bigger than people may first imagine. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily just giving a specific thing, but just a lifestyle and a thought process and a relationship of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you mean by generosity and the generosity challenge that you talk about?
Yeah. So I feel like we have this idea, especially in kind of Christian culture, that a healthy marriage or a happy marriage is kind of like what perfect Christians look like. Like if you're showing up to church and you and your husband are super happy and nothing's wrong, then people are going to think like they have everything together. They have the perfect Christian life. And I feel like, okay, that is super great, but it can go so much further. And I talk about generosity as this thing that's expected from all Christians, but it's so hard to do if you feel like your marriage is constantly draining you. You know, if you are stressed out about the fight you just had, you're not going to be in a place to go and serve in church on Sunday or something like that. I give an example of when Josh and I first became foster parents, and we had our first placement right at the start of summer 2022. And if our marriage did not have that strong foundation, and if we had not been working on our conflict resolution and communication and all of these things and learning to cover each other in grace, then it would have just like fallen apart because that was a very difficult time. We doubled the number of kids we had overnight. Plus, they brought in a lot of trauma from their background, and we were dealing with those trauma behaviors. And it was a very stressful time for the whole family. And Josh and I really just had to lean on each other so much during that time. And, if our marriage was not in a strong place, it would have just fallen apart. I feel like there were times when we felt this, I think from the stress, just like this sense of anger, like we were
Yeah.
on like a short leash. And it would have been so easy. And probably at times we did do this, like take it out on each other. But we had to understand, like, okay, this is a very difficult time. We need to have that grace towards each other. So yeah, I truly think that our marriage is a picture of Christ's relationship with the church when we are able to extend the love that we have from our marriage into the lives of others. So I feel like we can take it so much further, and it doesn't end just with us, but it can end with our kids, the people around us, our church community. And I feel like that is what truly makes a complete picture of Christ's relationship with the church.
Mm. I so appreciate that. I have seen some marriages where they are so inward focused, it's almost like they implode in on themselves. And that's not the way God built us as humans to thrive. And
Yeah.
for you to talk about, frankly, early in your marriage that you have learned, and together with Josh, it's not just about us. It's about God's love flowing through us, beyond us, that there's a
Hmm.
purpose bigger than just the two of us. What I know about mental health too, it's just a important principle of good mental health, that it's not all about me. Don't just do navel gazing. Lift your sights, help somebody else. And it's not only good
Yeah.
for you as an individual, it's good for your marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's almost like an epidemic happening of people just focusing on themselves and their own flaws, their own needs. And we hear all the time, you need to love yourself before you can love anyone else. And I think it's true. Like you need to take care of yourself, you need to have boundaries. But I think there's this hyperfixation on self and what I'm getting out of this. And if it's not serving me, then I'm going to leave. And no one's talking about how you can serve your spouse and how you can love them better by being self-sacrificing. And I think that's a huge component that's missing in a lot of relationships today is the idea that you can actually serve your spouse and make their life better and use your strengths to help them. And with the inner focus, I think it also is kind of a hyperfixation on little problems. Like that word didn't make me feel good. And that's fine. Like it's fine to recognize that, but I think there's a hyperfixation on it. And there's not like this sense of grace, like, okay, they're having a hard day. I'm gonna let that one pass or something like that, you know? So you kind of have to pick and choose your battles and also look at the bigger picture. Like, what are my goals with my marriage? Like I want a long-term happy marriage that glorifies God, makes my spouse's life better. And because of that, I'm not going to retaliate against certain behaviors. I'm not going to hold the grudges that I feel like holding. It really just kind of helps to shift your mindset when you kind of look at that bigger picture of the type of marriage that you want to have.
Yeah. In thinking about the kind of marriage that you want to have, a thought that more than anything else stuck out to me as I looked at what you've written, and that is don't only agree to not divorce. Agree
Hmm.
that you are going to continue to work on your relationship. This is going to be something I and the two of us together continue to invest in for the long haul. That it doesn't
Yeah.
end on the wedding day, it begins on the wedding day of you learning to love well each other, your family, and beyond your family.
Yeah. I remember when Josh and it was when we first got married. We were still in college. And I remember going back to school that fall and, talking before one of the classes. And people are asking what you got up to over the summer. I was like, well, I got married. Um, and after class, this younger student ran up to me and he's like, how did you know that Josh was the one? Like, how did you know you want to get married? And I remember telling him, I knew that Josh he had this humility about him and he also cared so much about God's truth. And because of that, I just knew that no matter what we came up against, he was going to be humble before God and seek um God's will over his own in any circumstance that showed up. And so that gave me the confidence that no matter what trial we met,
Yeah,
he was going to rise to that occasion and seek to work it out. And so that gave me so much confidence going into our marriage that like, okay, fights will happen, disagreements will happen, hard times will happen. But he has this sense of humility where he's not always going to fight for himself. He's going to fight
yeah,
for us.
yeah.
So yeah, I feel like that characteristic alone like gives you so much confidence going into a marriage. And I think that's really important for anyone who is dating and considering marriage to look for in a spouse.
Good and important advice.
Yeah.
You are giving advice to young people preparing for marriage and early in marriage. Just as we kind of move toward the close here, let people know about the ministry and the writing that you do. And we've alluded to your book a few times. Just mention that to people because I think this is some really good stuff that people need.
Yeah, so if you're dating or engaged, I have a couples devotional that goes for a whole year called Together with Christ, and you can find that on Amazon. And then if you've been married for a few years and you find your marriage is struggling and you're just not sure, what's happened with it over the years, you can find I Thought This Would Make Me Happy also at on Amazon or my website, chelseadamon.com.
Mm. And we'll make sure that there are links if you're watching under this video, if you're listening in the show notes. Chelsea, this has been so uplifting. Many, many blessings to you in your marriage, in your family, in your ministry, in your writing. This has been awesome. God bless you.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much for having me on.
I know if your heart was open during that conversation, you heard some things that you yourself can step into in dealing with your marriage and making it a healthier, more loving place, a better example of who God is, who he seeks to be to us, Christ in the church. Do check the links. We have the link under this video to Chelsea's website, some of her social media, and then her book, I Thought This Would Make Me Happy: How to Fight Less, Forgive Faster, and Cultivate Joy in Your Marriage. This kind of ongoing investment will pay off. I don't know the details of where you are right now in your marriage or what the future holds. Of course, only God knows that. But I do know that learning these things and investing in your marriage will make things better. You will be more fulfilled and satisfied when you take ownership. Chelsea talked about learning that I'm the one responsible for my happiness, for my heart. You can learn the same, and it will do good for your marriage as well. I want to remind you of my book, Sexpectations: Reframing Your Good and Not So Good Stories About God, Love, and Relationships. We certainly talk about marriage and married sex in this book, although it is not only for married people, it's for any relationship status, but nurturing the heart posture that you need is what will bring the intimacy in your marriage that you desire if you're married. Thank you again for being part of our family here. Make sure you're subscribed so you get our material every time it comes here on YouTube, at least weekly. I would love to hear from you. You can leave a message under this video or confidentially. You can use the contact page on our website, drcarolministries.com. That comes directly to me and is confidential. Until next time, may God bless you.